Everybody's attention, please. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started for this afternoon. We got a great lineup this afternoon. Continue on a lot of good topics. And so Micah is going to kick us off this afternoon here after lunch. So hopefully you guys got your sandwiches and got a little bit of food in there, and not too bad. Should be a good lineup this afternoon. And then we got 3 this afternoon and cake cutting. So, one thing too, push real quick before you get started. We're still selling glasses if anybody's interested. So, just want to reiterate that. So, I'm going to let you kick it off.
All right.
Yours.
Thank you very much. So, once again, thank you for everyone that put together this conference. I'm having a great time learning a lot of things. I'm coming at you not only after lunch, but also with a GRC talk. So I'm going to leave it at that. With that being said, growing up, I played a card game called Magic the Gathering. It was founded in 1993, and in many ways, I learned a lot of concepts, a lot of strategy that is directly applicable to my role as an IT security engineer and architect within the organization that I work for. For those that do not know, Magic the Gathering, or MTG as it's called, is a social card game in which 2 or more people create their own customized decks based out of cards that they choose to play in that game. Today, there's about 50,000 cards that have been released over the 29 years of the game. At the heart, MTG is a game of strategy, resource management, and requires tracking of both known and unknown knowledge. What does that sound like? That sounds like what we do, what challenges we face in information security. That being said, one of the most beautiful things in my mind about the game is that to this day, you can take cards printed this year, put them in with cards from the very first set, and it tells a clear story. The cards seem to work with each other. And that's one of the greatest things in my mind about this game, is they've been able to craft their story, craft their narrative. They've been clearly able to go through and to define what each color, what each card object does, and how they interact in a consistent way over 29 years. And that's something interesting. So, how do you win in Magic? There are many different ways. The first and most obvious is you start with a certain amount of life and you reduce your opponent's life down to 0. You can go through and you can win if your opponent gains 10 poison counters. If you try to draw a card from an empty deck, you're going to lose. If you are such an obnoxious opponent that your opponent concedes, you win. Some cards in and of themselves have victory conditions, and some cards have special text that negate victory conditions. Once again, how do you go through and how do you win within your role? I would argue that a SOC analyst, they probably go through and have a different victory condition in their day, in their week, in their month, than somebody that might be on the help desk or somebody that's on the CISO. So we need to understand within our role, within our organization, how do we win? What metrics do we care to go through and measure? And how do we communicate our success as IT and IT security? That being stated, then one of the great things about Magic is there are different ways or formats that you can play the game. In a game of Limited, you start with seal product and you build a 40-card deck. And what this is great about is it allows anyone to sit down and to have a chance at having a deck at the same power. Then you get to more constructed formats, which is where you pick exactly which cards from your collection. And Standard, that's one of the default ways to play. And you roughly can play with cards that were printed in certain sets about 2 years old. It constantly refreshes. Modern is, once again, it's a 60-card deck, and you can go through and you can pick cards since a certain expansion up, and it's a non-rotating, so if it's legal in Modern, it's always going to be legal in Modern. Legacy, is an even larger card pool. Whereas Commander, this is the first time that we have a 100 card deck, and it has some other special rules. I won't go into it. It's not really that important. And then you have Vintage, where pretty much every card from the beginning of the game is legal. Yeah, exactly. But as an IT security person, we have our own formats that we have to play in. And these could be things like rules, laws, regulations, and those are external factors. You might have contractual agreements. You might have your own internal company policies. You might have partner policies. So we need to go through and to be able to clearly dictate both what external and what internal controls, requirements that we have established and that we must go through and follow. Another concept that I learned a lot from was the concept of deck types. So when you're building these decks, there are three main archetypes that they built in the game. And that is aggro, where you want to win as fast as possible. There's combo, where you're looking to set up interactions between two or more cards that set up a condition that you instantly win on the spot. And then there's the control players. And the control players, they like to go through and to directly influence what the rules of the games are. And honestly, that was my most fun I had, was playing control. But when we think about it, IT security is a very large discipline, right? And so within that, an effective IT security program should touch all parts of technology within an organization. And this is where no one person can have mastery, in my mind, of all aspects of IT security. So we need to acknowledge where we are strong as well as where we are weak. For example, I gave my web application firewall talk to you last year, I believe. And in there, the main reason the project was going through and failing is because we weren't setting each other up for success. I had an application security engineer that was trying to do networking infrastructure work. Now, the guy's smart, he's talented, but he had to work a lot harder, and that was leading to delays. So instead, I realigned the project so that me, coming from a network admin, server admin role, I took care of the first part of putting the web application firewall online, where I then handed it off to my application security engineer to assist in the tuning, and then I handed it off to the support team to do the 24/7 care, maintenance, feeding, support of the device. So we need to actualize what are our strengths. We need to actualize what are our weaknesses, and we need to be able to make sure that we are setting both ourselves and our colleagues up for success. So one of the oldest traditions within Magic is they spent a lot of time on the psychographics. And they have within there the concept of Timmy, Johnny, and Spike. Now, Timmy is the type of player that gets excited by playing really big spells, really big creatures. To Timmy, the fun is in doing really big, awesome things. It's more about the quality of wins than the quantity. Johnny is a creative gamer. He likes to win, but he likes to win in his own way. So somebody that's more of a Johnny is actually going to develop certain combos or want to sculpt a certain setup on the board in order to win with style. And Spike is the hyper-competitive person that wants to win at any cost. So within each of these player psychodynamics, Wizards of the Coast, who creates Magic the Gathering, goes through, and in every set, they have cards that directly target each and every one of these player dynamics. So what motivates your company? Exactly. And I would assert, because I work at a very large organization, a global organization, in truth. When I go through and I take a look at what motivates our remote claims agents, it's something really different than even the claims agents that are on the call center, let alone be it management, be it the IT run. I often have a joke that where IT says the packets must flow. IT security says the packets must flow only to the authorized users. So we need to understand what each of our groups, what they're motivated with, so we can target our messaging, our branding, so that we can make doing the simple way, or the secure way, the simple way for each of those groups. And that's all about going through and understanding what motivates each of your groups. Now, one of the greatest things, in my opinion, that Magic the Gathering did is they created the color pie. And the color pie for each of the 5 colors in Magic, each of them means something. And so they created this visualization, and this was back in the 90s, that clearly set out what each color did, what were their strengths, what were their weaknesses, so that because of this, the existence of this very simple infographic, today, if I were to add a new card to a deck, it would feel like it fits. It's kind of hard for me to say, but having this distinct of a visualization that's very simple, very approachable to define each of the 5 types of Magic has allowed them to create a consistent narrative for over 29 years. This is what our color pie looks today. It's kind of messy. And this is, of course, my good friend's Optive's mapping. And, of course, these change by the month. And here's another one from Cyberscape. If any of you ever go to RSA, you can be blown away about the magnitude of the actual vendor hall. It's truly huge. And to this point, I almost get overwhelmed in looking at this. But there's something beautiful in seeing how different people have grouped different type of protective technologies in and throughout the entirety of the cyberspace. So this comes to a point where my boss came to me, and this was right around the time where, we were told 14 days to slow the spread. And he says, Micah, we've got to do something about our documentation. We've got to do something about communicating who and what we as IT security are. It needs to include people. It needs to include processes. It needs to include the technologies and the controls that we have in place. And I had to go and grab a bottle of bourbon because I knew where he was trying to lead me. Just an odd thing happened to me the other day. I went through and I got a call from one of the ITSOs, it's the technical term for CISO in my organization, and I've been sentenced to 1.5 years of policy mapping within my organization. Sentenced. Yes, just 1 bottle. With that being said, we transformed from a 2-line of defense organization to a 3-line of defense organization. What does that mean? It means that no longer could IT and IT security write policy. Instead, what we could write under our new IT norms is we could write guidelines and we could write work instructions, and those be actually binding to the business. Now, what our internal risk management team did is they took the thing that is beauty, the thing that is a shining, nay, a golden example for IT security, NIST 853, and they bastardized it. They added control requirements that, if I were to read them strictly, would say that portable media needs to be able to be remotely wiped. I was called flippant when I held up a USB stick. I said, how do I remotely wipe this? It does not have a CPU. It does not have a network connection. But then you're requiring the CPU on the computer that it's plugged into. So this is where we needed to obviously communicate better as IT security, our mission, our vision, our values, what we're doing, and quantify it. So, to bring this all together, we need to be able to answer these types of questions. How do you how do you win within your organization? What role or roles do you play in your organization, i.e., what type of a deck are you? How can you best visualize your resources? What constraints do you have, and how do you communicate it? So once again, the idea of the color pie. How do you communicate where your strengths and your weaknesses are? How do you know what motivates your individual groups within your business? And are you able to clearly define your architecture? So this is reminiscent of my first example. So I know it's very small, but that's to show you even and I modeled a generic medium-sized business and all of the things that we would have to go through and to do in order to have a decent visualization of IT security. This goes through, it covers technology, controls, process, procedures, and people. So let's dig into it. So, anything in the blue is an IT security technology stack. So that is going to be a device. That could be like Windows servers, Linux servers, firewalls, routers, web application firewalls. We have an IT security technology type. We have an IT security program, and we have at a high level policies. So, breaking it down into kind of like a car dealership. The IT security technology stack, that's like a car manufacturer, where the technology type, that's your car model, and the IT security program, well, that's the different groups within the organization that allow it to work. So you might have a finance group, you might have a mechanics group, you might have a Salesforce group. And finally, we have the policies, and all of these interact with each other. And that's really what I was trying to go through and show with the visualization. Any questions so far? So, for example, I have the concept of organizational servers. So, we have a Windows server, and we can see I just went through and I listed the different types of controls that we had applied to our Windows servers. Likewise, I did the same thing with the Linux, and then I realized that some of our devices are not our traditional Windows images, they're not our traditional Linux images, they're usually appliances that are built on some sort of Linux or BSD that have customized software, and many a time we don't even have the passwords to log into the actual OS, so I created a non-standard servers and or appliances group to capture those. Likewise, this is an example of our program stack. So within this group is the orange box represents a team within our organization, and we can actually put the names of the people in there. And then I created a tools or controls that group is responsible for. And the idea is that all of these are supposed to be clickable so that you could just jump from one to another. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but we'll talk about it later. And then the final thing that I wanted to go through and map in was the policies. So these are things like your baseline security standard. Maybe you might have a different name for it. It could be your cloud security policy. It could be your system hardening guides. But I wanted to go through for each of our formal policy documents, have a representation of it that is open, that is friendly, that is very accessible to people. And so when I presented the initial concept to my boss, he liked it. He liked it that it boiled it down to, well, it wasn't a one-pager, it was a single image, but if you were to print it out, it'd be multiple pages. But it's something that we could take to the board. We could take to our architecture and engineering. We could take to our auditors. And we could say, this is how we provide security to our organization. But I wasn't very happy with that. I mean, it's great that I had a picture, but one of the problems that I have day in and day out is, and I find this with larger organizations, the larger you get, the harder it is to make sure that all parts of IT and IT security are fully aware of what is being required of them, of all of the devices that you have to go through to protect, all of the policies that you're bound by. To this point, I was reached out to by the ITSO just the other day, and I was presented a document from legal that had been existing for a significant period of time. I went through, I was reading it, this was a legal policy document that was defining how IT and IT security had to operate in our part of the world. Only under our new IT documentation standards, I'm questioning, does legal even have that ability? Now, I love a lot was being brought into this document, or a lot that was in the document, but I thought that it should be in either IT security, IT, or possibly our risk management policies, our work instructions, our guidelines. And so this goes through and is one of the main reasons, or this type of situation was one of the main reasons why I wanted to take that visualization and I wanted to make it more. I wanted to make it interactable. I wanted to have a single place where I could point anyone in IT to go through and to be able to find out the who, what, where, why, and how for each of those components, to have them linked to each other. So I got the idea of building out a wiki. And so I jokingly called the project Amor Fati, which means to love fate. Because let me tell you, I was in some dark policy mapping times at the point. So I wanted it to be more than just a video. I wanted it to be interactive. I wanted it to link to all of the different components. I wanted it to have a one-page summary for each control, each program, each policy that clearly explains the who, what, where, when, why, the how. I wanted it to have links to where more information on that component is stored so that somebody, if they were authorized to have access, could go to this tool, do a quick lookup and find, oh, the more technical documentation is right here at this SharePoint link, and just go through and go at it. I wanted to reach out to team members and get them the direct information on who to contact, how to contact. Maybe there's a certain email that entire group uses, making it easier to find out information and report information. And I wanted each of the controls, the tools, the program, not only to map back to internal policy, but also go through and map back to external standards, external rules, laws, regulations, where applicable. So, I started out saying I wanted to do a rapid proof of concept. So I went through and I settled, okay, I'll spin up an Ubuntu server. Pretty simple, a simple VM. I looked at all of the wiki applications, and because at the time I hadn't played around much with Docker, I chose one that was based on Docker. That way I was learning something new. So I chose wiki.js, open source. I found it to be very easy to go through and to work with. I'm not saying that I would use this in a final build. I was just saying for a prototype, this was actually pretty good. I added to that a couple rum and cokes, and I used... Well, there's a reason why rum is first, my friend. And so, with that, I started the build. And I do have a copy. I can put it on a USB stick if anyone is interested and wants to play around with it. However, this is not meant to be run in production. To do the full build of the wiki system, or wiki.js, it literally was like 15 minutes. It was very intuitive, very easy to start, and we'll go through some of the processes here in just a minute. But once again, it has default credentials baked in. Do not run this in production. So, basically, if you do want this, I'm more than happy to give it out, but you import the VM, say I moved it, make sure the network type is bridged, and then once you power it on, you're going to have to go through and log in. Once again, it's a default credential. Do not run in production. Then you do 3 commands to go through and to launch the 3 components that or Docker components you need, that being the database, the wiki, and the wiki update companion. Once you go through and spin those up, I usually give it about 30 minutes. It's pretty lightweight, pretty nimble. I go through and I just validate a sudo Docker status, and that's going to go through and it's going to show you how well it is going through, and or it'll show you that all of the Docker components are up and running. And then you're going to need to go through and find the actual IP address that your system has. So because I'm on my laptop, I don't have that big of a screen, I just use an IP config /a and grep, and then I start with like 192, and it'll spit it right out. And then finally, from your primary system, the way that you access this is you just go through and in a web browser, go to http:// and then the IP address that your VM has been assigned. Once again, here's some more information about it. And now to the live demos. So, no, I did not. But I did sacrifice a Budweiser. So, although I had to get up here on stage, so the bottle of rum comes after. That comes tonight. So, I already started the VM. Pretty simple. I logged in with the username Amarfati and the password change me. Once again, do not run this in production. And that being said, now all I have to do is I'll just bring this up. Hey, it works. So my idea was, and once again, this was a rapid prototype, but what I wanted was any of these boxes or the text in any of these to go through and to be clickable, and it'd take you right to that area. Now, I'm not a graphics designer, but I do draw on a drawing board a lot, be it physically or in Visio. But the idea was that all of these links would be directly clickable. And so, as you can see, I went through, and this is how bored I got at the start of the pandemic. I wrote over 195 pages of fictitious documentation on a fictitious company just to fully build this out. So, indeed. So when I go through, and let's take a look at the technology stack, I can go through and say, I want to look at how we are doing our technology stack. I can come in, and the major components were bring your own device, client systems, so laptops, cell phones that are owned by the organization, cloud, what we're doing in the future, identity, network, organizational servers, and virtualization. So let's just go through for networking because that's very fun. And then I created a document for firewall. And once again, these were all meant that everything would be clickable and take you right where you wanted to go. So we'll bring up firewalls, and you can see I created an executive summary. We'd have a capabilities description, a scope, a location, the data classification, the business security checklist mappings, the control mapping, so whether this is in the scope of NIST or PCI, etc. Normal contact process, emergency contact process, who's the service or the control owner, who are the subject matter experts. So within my organization, we have, think of the service owner as that is the person that is responsible to make sure that that control is actually up, it's running. It's more of a management role where the subject matter experts, those are the technical experts that are hands-on doing the work. I wanted to have a list of all of the CIs for that type if it's a physical device. The technical overview, so this would be where we go through and put a link to the more technical documentation that if a person is authorized, they could just click and get in. Management instructions, where are their run books, their start of day, start of week, start of month, how do we update, say, a firewall rule, we'd have those links, and then a link towards any more technical documentation. The goal was to make sure that this summary was very simple, very approachable. I wanted it to be very well defined so that if we have an auditor and they say, how are you protecting your firewalls? The ITSO, or the person that received the request, could come to this page, just do a control print. Here's a start of the information of how we protect our firewalls, how we do this. And then if the auditor needed more, we could go through and justify more. But one of the challenges I have at an enterprise level, as big as we are, is just knowing what my colleagues are doing, knowing how our cloud is being architected, making sure that we have consistent identity and access management policies across all of the technology that we implement. And that really was one of the genesises that led me down setting up this rapid type of a documentation and actually going through and building this type of a system out for our organization. And one of the key things to me, in order to be successful, we need to be able to effectively communicate. This is who we are as IT and IT security. This is how we protect the organization. These are the tools, the controls. These are the asset types that we're going through collecting. And I believe very much so that this type of a system can help make things more open and more transparent. And when we make things more open and transparent, I think we tell a great story and we win. I know this was a little bit short, but are there any questions?
How do you keep it up to date?
So right now we are in the start of the building process. Once again, it's a very large organization, but the idea that I had for various technology groups, say we have one person that owns how we do our SIM. They would own their SIM part, and then they would be required once a year to go through and formally assert, yes, this is actually up to date. That's how we're starting it. For those groups, it would be the manager for that group to go through and make sure that that setup was correct. And for the actually policy documents that we're going through and we have records for, it'd be the responsibility of the document owner. And once again, they would keep that up to date yearly at a bare minimum.
So it's basically still a manual process.
It really is a manual process. It's more about making it very friendly for people to go through and ingest, because I can't tell you how many times I get somebody just typing me and saying, hey, do you know our policy on this? Or do you know how we protect that? And some of the times I can say yes. Give me a minute, I'll put it on my to-do list. Sometimes I'll come back and say, no, but you really should reach out to this person. And some people, even after I've been with this organization for over 10 years, I still don't know how we do X, Y, Z.
Is it still in implementation stage, or it's been implemented?
So we are still going through and generating the copious amount of documentation. So it's still an implementation phase, which is why I spent the start of my pandemic coming up with a rough POC so that I could share this approach with others.
Another question. In the process of implementation, process of development, did you have any problems to bringing on board IT organization, which is not under cybersecurity? What kind of organizational and political challenges?
I wouldn't say that it's really a split between IT and IT security. I have a very broad definition of what is IT security. I think if you're protecting the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of your company's assets or data, I think you are IT security. So I think it's less so the split between IT security and IT. I think it's more of a split in people don't like to do documentation. I want to be out doing the fun things. I want to be doing the sexy things. I don't want to be doing the nerd work. Danielle?
I just think this is still a lot of overlap between a good GRC tool. I can see why a GRC tool might not be user-friendly for the rest of the organization. So I'm curious how you plan to integrate that back into other components of your program.
So I absolutely see what you're saying with a good GRC tool, and we do not have that fully implemented. Once again, the bigger use case for this was to enable internal resources to find out the basic who, what, where, when, why within IT and IT security services.
In your case, is this going to eventually become process management or things that need to be done?
That is definitely a use case. So the question was, is that going to go through and eventually have a formal process tied to it? Is that correct?
Tied to all the different areas of the things that are actually done as normal functions.
So there's a separate project that's doing this. This is more just trying to tell a consistent story to those both. I see the main use case of this is to tell a consistent story to those outside of IT and IT security on how we do things, as well as to be able to tell those within IT security and IT, if you wanted to know about a process, here's where you need to go to learn the more technical details once you have the approval to get that documentation, to more self-feed, if you will.
Mind if I throw a wrench in this?
Yeah, absolutely.
We pretty much did the same thing in the Fortune 500 company I was in. The ultimate end goal, which most people didn't realize, it was so this could be turned over to an outsourced company and outsource the entire IT and security.
Absolutely. So the statement was that Daryl had gone through and did this at a very large organization, the whole IT department, and at the very end, it was so that they could outsource this. Now, from a point of view, yes, that's a risk. There are challenges with insourcing. There are challenges with outsourcing. I've worked on both sides of the house, and I will say that if you do outsource, the better that you have, that you understand how your IT and your IT security works, the better your managed service experience is going to be. However, I definitely go through and make sure that if you are a business and you are looking for outsourcing, that you understand clearly the roles and responsibilities, you understand the SLAs, and you make sure that those are in line with your organization's standards and your organization's needs. To me, the challenge is I constantly have people coming and saying, what do I need to do to deploy this type of technology? And instead of going through and being aware of the various policies and procedures, they are having to, and being able to self-feed, they're having to go through and reach out to others and create more work. So it's there's a lot of inefficiencies, and the goal was to make both IT and IT security being able to better self-feed through this type of a wiki system.
What's your strategy for taking the show on the road within your organization outside of IT?
So we are going through and building this actively now, and it's going to be a tool where we're going to basically interact with our internal marketing department to go through and promote it within our various sites, within our various communities, and just use this as this is a starting point, a one-on-one on how to get IT security services, IT and IT security services from the organization. So it's going to be a lot of socialization from practitioners.
But you've engaged the marketing department to do that?
Our internal, yes. So creating like little infographics and putting them in strategic places within existing, say, SharePoint sites and stuff like that.
I got a question.
Yes.
How will this help you with your gaming?
It doesn't, because I gave it up, because that hobby is very, very expensive. Many of the cards that I have are worth more than their weight in gold. Any other questions?
Have you seen this anywhere else?
Not this. I have not seen this wiki-style approach to documentations elsewhere. A lot of what I see is, here's a shared folder with a bunch of different policies, or here's a SharePoint site with a bunch of policies, and not having a consistent way in which we can go through and to tell our own story, I think is a significant weakness for ourselves.
Confidentiality, integrity, accessibility, CIA assessment, which goes back to the NIST RMF framework. And I just, after seeing your tool, I did a search. Are you familiar? There's an Exacta 360 tool that is being marketed out in the community to be able to capture and categorize systems.
No, I was not aware of that. Thank you for bringing that to my attention.
I remember there's another one that starts with an S, but I can't remember what it is.
Yeah, I just wanted to throw together a rapid prototype because I'm not a, you can clearly tell I'm not a UI designer. You can clearly tell that I'm not a web developer. So I just wanted to have something that I could put in front and say, this is what our documentation, at least our initial documentation, could look like. Because I get asked a lot, how, and these are usually from management types, how do we do X? How do we do Y? How do we do Z? And for projects that I've worked on, I usually have really good answers and really good documentation, but for projects that I'm not on, it may or may not be as robust. And so I was trying to think of a way, how can we make sure that we all capture the same base? Exactly.
Are you tying it back to these controls? I mean, is that part of what you got embedded in there?
Yeah, so there was a part where we can go through and do control mappings right here.
And are you going to use that to, will you use that to generate any kind of documentation that you might need for an auditor?
So that's a second level iteration of this type of approach. I've given it some thought. Right now I'm just working on getting the actual first line.
I said the dirty word auditor.
That's the reality. Yeah, just input from that question there. When we build out, ours wasn't necessarily this. It was obviously those other things, and we kind of framed it around ITIL processes also. But we created this whole database structure of processes, policies, controls, the whole 9 yards, and literally just gave the auditors access to it. Then they just left us alone. No longer had to do it.
That's one of the primary use cases, is to go through and to open this up to internal auditors. For external auditors, we'd expect that a company resource would go through and interact with a company resource who could then go through and create print, or not print screens, but print a PDF. Yeah. But the idea is to try to have a consistent story of how we go through and define our processes, our procedures, the controls that we apply to our different asset types in a clear and consistent way, so that we are able to go through and to defend, this is what we're doing and this is why we're doing it as IT and IT security, improve value. Any other questions?
I hope you can tell you're really onto something here, man.
I'm sorry?
You're really onto something here. There's a critical need for this. Just all the questions and comments that have come up here. And I appreciate your comment that you're not a UI designer, but tapping into a wiki, having referenceable information, you've got a framework here, a foundation that when you get to another phase where you're pulling in, right, you lay down some APIs to some of the sources you're tapping into. You can automate some of this validation, start bleeding into that GRC space. But to Danielle's point, making this accessible to the people.
Yes.
The wizardry, I'm going to come back because I'm a huge Magic fan myself, thank you. Started playing in '93. You take that secrecy working in information security, and the thing that makes it scary for all the people we work with, and you're making it less scary, and that's a big deal. I really like this.
Well, thank you. This is my least technical talk that I've ever put together, so I'm a little bit outside of my comfort zone. Thank you for letting me beta test it here with you. I know I went a little bit fast, but I think you're more interested in the IT security side than the Magic the Gathering side. But Danielle, I saw you had...
I was thinking it would be really cool to have like a little video embedded in it, like a 30-second, why is this technology important?
Oh, absolutely.
Like if I'm, the dumb user, click on that, and I'm going to watch the video. It's 30 seconds long. That's my speed right there. I don't want to read all that stuff.
Oh, absolutely. That could be an easy add-on, but the idea is to move the documentation into a consistent way, to digitize it, and to make it easily accessible to everyone. And that really, was the heart. This was just a rapid, well, not so rapid proof of concept, because honestly, I built out every one of the topics, so SIM, NAC, vulnerability scanners, I have active content for a fictitious company on each one of those. Any other questions? Thank you very much.